I'm regretting it very seriously, but I appreciate it.
Well, at least that's a bipartisan problem.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman.
It's the human condition.
As I went through the other amendments, it became more obvious that we had a huge difference in what to do next, whether we were to trust the same people who failed us in Madoff and other oversight, and each of us has a different vision. The one thing that this amendment recognizes is that the S.E.C., at least under Chairman Donaldson, has in the past hired outside professionals, had a study done, and then at the end of the day, nothing changed. My amendment is intended to recognize that this Congress, on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, voted to have a commission, an independent, congressionally sponsored commission, review the many aspects, including the Securities and Exchange Commission's failures, that led to the financial meltdown. My amendment is intended to leverage that commission and its powers and its system to do the same thing in a number of areas. Some of the questions would include whether fundamental reform is necessary in order for the S.E.C. to fulfill its mission. Not intended to be partisan in any way. They are free to make a decision. Whether and how the performance of the S.E.C. and its employees should be improved. Again, we've had infinite discussion about some of the malfeasance, but no real conclusion in the other amendments. Whether and how the Security Exchange internal structure can be simplified, whether and how the Security Exchange internal management should be improved, etc. The point that I'm making is not what they do. I believe we want this done. The question is, will we use a leveraged asset that has already been established, that we already have bipartisan, bicameral agreement on, to do that? And I believe that we should do that. We should do it because it brings a broad agreement, and it does say to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the people you're already working with on other failures, you'll be working with on an improvement. I have no doubt that they will leverage many of the same outside experts in order to do this work, but I recognize that this is a commission structure that will report back primarily to this committee and will do its work in a way that will give Congress, and Mr. Kanjorski and the chairman and others, ongoing real insight into those improvements. I hope this is offered truly as a compromise that is not intended to do anything but say that this is a structure more likely to lead to changes that this committee would oversee than an independent, self-directed by the S.E.C., which under Chairman Donaldson was tried and at least in that case failed. With that, I would respectfully move it and yield back.
I'll reserve 5 minutes for myself, if I may, to respond. To the gentleman from California, I respect the effort and the work that's reflected in his amendment, but so that we can put this in context, the comprehensive study and the installation of the findings of the study are quite voluminously set forth in the House position. And the reason for that was it's a recognition that, look, not many agencies of government are functioning in the best way they can. We, on our side, we did not want to have the agency review itself and then try and take appropriate action within the agency to correct itself. So we said an outside audit, comprehensive audit of the entire agency. The reason it was constructed and asking questions, not too dissimilar to yours, I think actually more thorough than your study. But the reason was we want to set a predicate, if we can, that if we're successful with the S.E.C. and do it on a reasonable basis, we can take that same model and transfer it to almost any agency of the United States government, when ultimately we should move to total reform of the United States government. I think that if we start the commission thing, you know, we could have 500 commissions in this town operating. The reality is we should have outside auditing and studies made of particularly the significant agencies, and there are many of them that are not functioning too well. I think just the other day somebody said something about Interior Is there a minerals section in Interior?
Mineral Management Service.
Maybe, yeah. It seems to me that's the kind of agency that we ought to, on the outside, do a depthful analysis and a comprehensive study of, and not ask the internal people to do the study. We're just going to get back justifications of why they should continue to exist as they do exist, even though we have wrong things happening. I'm not an apologist for the S.E.C. I think the S.E.C. made some significant contributions to the credit crisis, certainly over the last 7, 8 years, and there were a lot of failures. But on the other hand, some of the debate I've heard today, and when we get into these situations, it seems it wants to lend itself to, well, you bad Republican president, or you bad Democratic president, or you bad Republican Congress, or you bad Democratic Congress causes. The reality is we can sit here all day and night, and we can cause commissions to hear testimony and everything, and most of them in this town ultimately will come to a conclusion that nobody was really at fault. Here's some good things to do, and we'll put that study up on the shelf, and nothing will ever happen. This way, we're trying to get to this by doing a outside, sort of, and I hate to use the commercial term, a McKinsey study. Get out there, authorize them with a response.
If the gentleman would yield, McKinsey's who did the last study that nothing happened on.
Exactly.
But now with that, Mr. Chairman, that's what you're asking for again by asking them to hire an outside study. They hired McKinsey the last time.
Absolutely, but they internally decided to hire, and the parameters were not set by the Congress, it was set by the agency. For the exact reasons we don't want to encourage that. Now, you can substitute a multi-million dollar commission, give them 18 months. I think we have several commissions operating today. It's a great job, they tell me. I think you several $100s a day and huge $1 million staffs, and you travel back and forth from your home to Washington on a long-term basis. But there are few damn things we ever accomplish with these commission studies. I think we ought to push that aside and say, look, we're telling the S.E.C. to take their money, since we've taken them off budget, and allow them to raise the money, take as much. I don't care what they spend, to tell you the truth, for that study. To do a depthful, comprehensive study in a reasonably short period of time, get it to themselves, get it to the Congress of the United States, get it to the President, and then let us take that study with them and decide how to reform this agency. If you appoint a commission, what you're basically saying, and you know, at some point in the future, I may support your proposition, but it sort of is surrendering that democracy and representative government just doesn't work. This is my last attempt to organize it in such a way to say we believe we can internally in this government reform ourselves. And if we establish that type of model, we can apply it across the board.
And I appreciate it. If the gentleman would yield, my reason for suggesting and really building on everything you're asking for, I have no objections to any of the things you wanted to look into, is that everyone, I believe, every single person that's been at the conference so far, we all voted for that commission I'm talking of.
The gentlewoman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment. Many of you probably saw in May that there was on the cover of Time magazine was Mary Shapiro in the front, and Sheila Bair and Elizabeth Warren, and they were called the new sheriffs. And I was glad to see that 3 women were there. But that's not my point. My point is that I think that Mary Shapiro has done a very good job and has really taken on an awful lot to try and clean up the mess. However, I think that the mess is such that she does need help, and that's why I think that we need either why we need to have this commission. And the commission versus what Mr. Kanjorski talks about as being the finding a high-quality consultant differs in the fact we've had several commissions who I think have been very effective. For example, the 9/11 Commission, and commissions that have been on a bipartisan basis, and I think they've come up. And I think that either we do need this, but I think that a commission would work much better than the so-called consultant. And having seen the McKinsey where that has was not effective, and so I would say that I would really support this commission.
The gentleman from California sought recognition before.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in favor of this measure. Going to Mr. King-Jaworski's comments, nothing prevents the outside audit in this legislation. But what this amendment does is it sets up a commission to examine basically and reform the culture at the S.E.C. And that's been the problem. You know, if we go back to Mr. Markopoulos's words when he testified before us, that overlawyered culture at the S.E.C. that needs to be addressed, I don't think there's any debate that this institution has failed fairly miserably. And just to go back to that Ponzi scheme that Bernie Madoff concocted, you had 16 years where the S.E.C. examined Bernie Madoff's firm 8 times and never was able to uncover the problem. But when Mr. Markopoulos discussed this with us, he said one staffer at the S.E.C.'s Boston branch understood this risk, understood what he was conveying, and yet was silenced by the overlawyered offices in New York and in Washington. So again, we have a culture problem at the agency that has to be addressed, and I think this amendment by Mr. Issa takes care of that problem. I wanted to go back to what we were told in committee here. Mr. Markopoulos attempted to explain to S.E.C. officials countless times in detail why Mr. Madoff's returns were simply not possible given his investment strategy. He noted, and by the way, the S.E.C. confirmed this when they testified before us, he noted the lack of understanding within the S.E.C. of the financial markets, the lack of expertise in terms of having people really had been portfolio managers. I mean, there was no way for them to be able to detect even the most basic Ponzi scheme. So Mr. Markopoulos attributes this episode to a lack of market experience combined with what he calls an investigative ineptitude within the organization. Something that we've heard, by the way, over and over and over again in testimony here. So the failure of the S.E.C. in the Madoff case, that was not an isolated event. Earlier this year, we heard that the S.E.C. was aware beginning in 1997 that Alan Stanford was in fact operating a Ponzi scheme, but had never managed to close that down. So whether it was Madoff or it's the Stanford incident or the failure to force laymen to correct accounting irregularities, which frankly exacerbated the market panic following its failure, or countless other cases that we've heard about, these problems did not arise from simply a lack of funding. They arose because of a deeper structural flaw within the Commission, and we now have an opportunity with a well-thought-out amendment here to address this and to create a commission that will go through and correct this. And so I'm going to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Issa.
Perhaps in hopes of changing the gentleman from Pennsylvania's mind from I might support in the future to I might support now, we all understand what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico today, and we all have seen BP and others sequentially try different fixes. And we all wish, and I'm sure British Petroleum wishes, that they had tried to have as many of them available almost simultaneously, so we wouldn't have these days, or in this case, of oil spewing between different things they're trying, some of which didn't work, some of which are working a little bit. In this case, during the next 18 months from enactment, we would have 2 concurrent efforts. One is a study of the culture. One is an oversight by an independent commission. Another is yours, which is very good, which is the S.E.C. trying to heal itself, to work on it. At the end of 18 months, whatever was done well would be recognized by the Commission. The Commission would have no mandate other than its small cost. And remember, when we're talking trillions of dollars in loss, I would say that even those flights of this good job are well spent. The Commission would mean that at the end of 18 months, whatever wasn't succeeded by the S.E.C. could also be viewed by the Commission. It's a belt and suspenders. But don't we want a belt and suspenders if we're trying to make sure that during the next 18 months bad things don't happen again on anyone's watch? I yield back.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes to take issue with the notion that there was some structural flaw at the S.E.C. or just the culture of the SEC. There were people appointed to office who had a philosophy of deregulation. There were conscious ideological decisions made. Now, William Donaldson was the chair of the SEC, first appointed by President Bush, and he was taking the job too seriously, and he was pushed out. And he was replaced by one of our former colleagues, Mr. Cox, who intellectually and honestly believed in minimal regulation. And so we had reference to this supervised self-supervision. That was not something that grew out of the SEC culture. That was imposed by ideological people opposed to regulation, who believed, as Alan Greenspan said regarding his failure to regulate subprime mortgages, that the market knew it better. The decision that Mary Shapiro just overturned was that the staff of the SEC, the career employees, essentially couldn't charge anybody with a violation above a certain fairly small level unless the commission okayed it. That was not the culture of the commission, quite the opposite. That was the commission as an ongoing entity being restrained by ideologues at the top who thought there was excessive restriction. So too much blame is being put on some of the individuals. They were obviously a mix of good and bad, and not enough attention is being paid to the fact that there was a choice made to draw back regulation and to believe in the market's self-corrective abilities beyond what the market had. Is there any further discussion? If not, the question is on the amendment.
Would the gentleman yield? I'd just make the point that this was over a period of 16 years, Mr. Chairman, on the Madoff case.
Yes,
so I think there is a question of competency on
the question of competence, but there's also a question of the people at the top, because some of the decisions made, the gentleman himself referred to the self-examining thing. That was a conscious ideological decision. The decision not to register hedge funds. Mr. Donaldson made it. He was overturned by the court. He was restrained by trying to remake it. So, yeah, as I said, there are people that aren't perfect, but there was also, and in particular over these last years, a conscious choice that people wouldn't regulate. The question now comes on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, just
along yield, or do you want to be recognized?
Excuse me?
Gentleman wish to be recognized on his own, or do you want me to yield?
Recognize, and I won't do the whole 5 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Yeah, I won't do the whole. It's troubling whenever any of these discussions get into the pointing the finger, A. It's also troubling whenever any of these discussions turn to say, well, it's all because of ideology and because who had which ideology here and who had it. You know, I can't think that it's all because of ideology. I have to think that there was actually fundamental structural problems at the SEC. And that's just not, now that I say there, that's just me thinking this. I think I heard that actually when we had Chairman Shapiro at one of those few hearings that she came to and testified. She said there are problems with the way the SEC was structured, not because of ideology, not because it was we're going to investigate more or investigate less or what have you. It was a structural impediments to actually performing the job. And that would explain, more than ideology, why, as the gentleman from California says, Madoff was not uncovered for 16 years. That would explain, more than ideology would, why when somebody from up New England tries to contact the SEC, there's all sorts of usual bureaucratic impediments for that person to get their way into to the right people. That would also explain, more than ideology, why the GAO found that there were internal control deficiencies, why there were significant management challenges, why there were material weaknesses. Those are not, when you think about it, ideological issues. I'm sure Chris Cox wasn't saying, well, I'm a conservative, so I'm going to engage in significant managerial problems or challenges here. No, maybe he was conservative or not, I don't know. But these are structural problems within the SEC. So I'll close on this. Sit back here for a moment. I'm getting the big picture. On the last amendment that I just had, we just all agreed that we are now going to give $400 million more, in essence, or maybe more, to the SEC than what the appropriators and what the wisdom of this Congress said we should have given them in the past. So we're going to do that. Now we're going to also say, but if we don't pass this amendment, we're going to let those same people who made those same flaws in the past to try to self-correct. So we're giving them more money. We're going to let them self-correct. I'm just picturing the hearing when we had all the Madoff folks here who were suffered under that scandal. If they were here today, are in the hallway and they heard the outcome of today's hearing is we're allowing the fox to guard the henhouse, we're allowing the fox to set up the fence and fix the henhouse, and we're going to give the fox a raise, they might be a little bit concerned. And I know I'll be going back to and I'll yield the rest of my time to the gentleman from California.
I move the previous question. I move the previous question.
Chairman,
I just moved the previous question. It is in order.
Inquiry.
What is the gentleman's parliamentary inquiry?
Could you let us know why you moved?
No, that's not a parliament.
Is there some-
No, I'm sorry, we're going to go by the rules. That's
Parliamentary
not a
inquiry.
parliamentary
I have a
inquiry.
point of inquiry.
Excuse me, I'm stressing the gentleman from Alabama. The motives of why someone makes a motion that is in order is not the subject of a parliamentary inquiry. The gentleman from California had an inquiry?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Isn't it true that a member given 5 minutes under the rule cannot lose that 5 minutes?
The gentleman
by
yielded back
Chairman?
his time.
No, he didn't. He actually said he yielded to me.
I'm sorry, the gentleman from New Jersey had yielded back his time.
No,
We didn't.
No, I did not.
Oh, I apologize. The gentleman had not yielded back his time?
I
thought he
did
had.
not. I was looking over to the gracious gentleman from California. I could tell he had a comment.
New Jersey wishes to yield the 2 minutes he has left, 2 minutes and 6 seconds. He may yield it to whoever he wishes.
I look forward to his insightful comments.
Who's he?
This gentleman over here from California.
The gentleman from California has been yielded to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll briefly close for all of us by saying when I was a freshman 10 years ago and you were on judiciary with me, you often gave me a great deal of insight and training about how this place worked. You even on occasions told me that, you know, you should vote for this bill and here's why, or if I were you, I would vote for it, but you won't do that. And I've never forgotten some of that counseling because it helped begin a process that today is useful. 10 years later, I realize that we always believe that if it's our party in the White House, because they tell us this, trust us, we'll fix it. And the other party, and you were the party out of power at that time, always says, you can't trust those guys, you got to do oversight. I might suggest to the chairman in closing that if you weighed in favor of belt and suspenders, not because you don't trust the chairwoman, not because you don't believe the administration is better than the last administration, and they may well be, but because during this time, wouldn't we want to be sure that the people we believe are good are also vindicated by outside commission that is nonpartisan, because there is this tendency by both of us to believe our party when they're running the place more than perhaps we would if the shoe was on the other foot. And I would only ask the chairman to consider what would he do if Chairman Cox were still.
Will the gentleman from New Jersey yield so I can
New
respond?
Jersey yield, ranking member.
I best yield to the ranking member.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I only have a few seconds. I don't think I'm on time. Arthur Levitt created the Independent Separate Office of Inspections. That was the office that failed to investigate Madoff. He was chairman. Arthur Levitt, you praised during 8 years of the Clinton administration when Madoff went on. William Donaldson, who you praised, was chairman. Chris Cox was only chairman for about a little less than 2 years, and at the end of his term, Madoff was prosecuted. And Mary
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman's time has expired. I move the previous question. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The previous question is ordered.
Oh, the previous question.
The question now comes on the amendment from the gentleman from California. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The question, the gentleman from Alabama asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Frank?
No.
Chairman Frank votes no. Mr. Kanjorski?
No.
Mr. Kanjorski votes no. Ms. Waters?
No.
Ms. Waters votes no. Mrs. Maloney? No. Mrs. Maloney votes no. Mr. Gutierrez?
No by proxy.
Mr. Gutierrez votes no by proxy. Mr. Watt?
No by proxy.
Mr. Watt votes no by proxy. Mr. Meeks?
No by proxy.
Mr. Meeks votes no by proxy. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Ms. Kilroy? Ms. Kilroy votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Conyers?
No by proxy.
Mr. Conyers votes no by proxy. Mr. Berman?
No by proxy.
Mr. Berman votes no by proxy. Mr. Towns?
No by proxy.
Mr. Towns votes no by proxy. Mr. Cummings?
No by proxy.
Mr. Cummings votes no by proxy. Mr. Backus?
Aye.
Mr. Backus votes aye. Mr. Royce?
Aye.
Mr. Royce votes aye. Mrs. Biggert? Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mrs. Capito?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Capito votes aye by proxy. Mr. Henserling? Mr. Henserling votes aye. Mr. Garrett? Mr. Garrett votes aye. Mr. Smith?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Smith votes aye by proxy. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 8 ayes and 14 noes.
And the amendment is defeated. The
Mr.
question
Chairman.
now comes on the offer.